So I'm not really going to talk about my research very much, about MDMA research or anything like that. I mean, it's more about my day job as a addiction psychiatrist that I'm going to talk a little bit about how current drug policy impacts very negatively on that work. And then I'll talk a little bit about some future directions, but most of this talk is briefly going to be about just the problems as they stand at the moment and the way in which policy is not the right way to treat these people, and it results in greater usage, greater problems, greater deaths, which is surely not what policy is all about. So this is what drives me in my everyday work. The links between child maltreatment and abuse and adult mental health problems, particularly addictions, are incredibly strong. Now, this isn't true for all drug users or even all drug addicts, but it is true for the majority of dangerous drug addicts, and that's just a fact. We did a recent audit of our caseload, and about 94% of the caseload of people with addictions to alcohol, cocaine, and heroin had some form of childhood trauma, so it's very common. My trajectory is kind of relevant to how we got here. So as an adolescent, I was interested in psychedelics. I trained to become a medical doctor and specialised in psychiatry. Then did child and adolescent psychiatry. And whilst I was doing child and adolescent psychiatry, I was working with the abused children in maltreated homes of all different forms of child abuse. And I became really interested in this developmental trajectory. And how the empathy switch in society seems to be switched off at some point. We have all this sympathy for these little abused 5 and 6 year olds, and you watch children in need and we throw all this cash at them, and these poor little victimised children who are being abused in their families. But what happens to those poor little abused victims at 5 and 6 when they get to be 11 or 12, and then they start wearing hoodies, and then they start smoking weed, then they start doing amphet, and by the time they're 18, 19, they're doing heroin and crack. Suddenly, we've lost our empathy. The public just sort of shifts. And I'm really fascinated as to how that happens. We have all this empathy for these little ones, but then suddenly they're public enemy number one. And that's kind of what drives me, really. When I'm there with my adult patients in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, addicted to heroin, alcohol, crack, cocaine, I see before me this little 3-year-old who was beaten and raped from the day go, at the beginning of their lives. And you have to have enormous amounts of compassion and empathy to be able to see people in that light. And for some reason in society, we lose that around this age 13, 14 level when they start becoming hoodlums. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the people with problems with addictive drugs. And as I said, this is not all drug users. A little bit about the stupidity and the non-fit-for-purpose scheduling and classification systems. Concentrate on a few drugs in particular, and then just a few slides at the end about where drug addiction and drug use could be going and how policy impacts on that. So, why do some people become addicted to some of the more dangerous drugs? So, it's not everybody, it's the nasty drugs that people get addicted to. Well, the point is this. Drug addiction is a biological, social and psychological problem. It's a health problem. And criminalising drug addiction does not answer the problem. Does not make it go away. You can make drugs illegal, you can put people in prisons. The vast majority of my caseload have been in and out of prison on a regular basis. 3 hops and a cot, they call it, going into prison. It's just the illegality of the drugs is not on their radar at all as to why they should or shouldn't be using the drugs. Having these drugs illegal does stop some of the nice middle-class people using drugs because they worry about getting their visas to America and they want to become teachers and they want to become solicitors. The vast majority of the people with problematic drug use, the illegality of it does not affect their choice of the drug. What it does is makes it very difficult to work with these people because you can't get to the health bit because you've got to go through all the criminal bits to help these people with this medical problem. So why do people take drugs? Well, we take drugs because we have brains. I say this to my patients all the time. Look, don't beat yourself up for liking heroin or crack. If you didn't like heroin or crack, you wouldn't have a brain, and vice versa. And in a way, the biological model can be broken down to this kind of interaction between these two different parts of the brain. This instinctive, old part of the brain in the nucleus accumbens, which is this biological drive to seek pleasure, and it's in interplay with the prefrontal cortex, the executive functioning, where we try and reason against those things. Now, the nucleus accumbens is this part of the brain which is dopamine mediated, and all sorts of different activities stimulate dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens. It's probably designed primarily for sex, food, sleep, the biological functions that we have to do, and we have to expend a lot of energy in pursuing those. But by some peculiar freak of nature, loads of exogenous compounds also tweak the same place. So the nucleus accumbens is set up to make us have sex, but actually it turns out that cocaine, cigarettes, heroin, golf, video games, chocolate, all these things also tweak the same place. So again, I say to my heroin addicts, of course you like heroin. Everybody likes heroin. I challenge anyone in the room to take heroin or crack and not love it. You will. And if you don't have a functioning brain. You actually have something wrong with your brain. We are hardwired to like that stuff. And the way the nucleus accumbens works is when you do tweak that part of the brain, it says, whatever you just did to yourself, do it again. Do it tomorrow, do it the next day, keep doing it. And that's a great thing to have when you're trying to make an organism have sex, which is a very energy inefficient process. But it is. No, if you're like a shrew, you have to eat a certain amount of ears of corn that day, or you will die of hypothermia that night. You have such a narrow index of energy in and energy out. Why are you really going to spend any time looking for a partner to have sex with them? There's no immediate gain. So why? We have a very powerful biological thing. Anyway, I've labelled that point. Our brains love drugs, and that's not our fault, and it's certainly not the drug user's fault. Now, in terms of my patients, there's a whole load of other factors that make why they might take drugs in this addictive way. People take drugs as self-medication, pain relief, self-medication against PTSD and childhood trauma, and all of those different forms of abuse that I mentioned. And social economic factors. Now, again, this is not entirely exclusive at all. It's like people take drugs from all different stratas of society. But the people who become addicts, on the whole, and this is just a fact in terms of the caseloads, are more represented in the lower socioeconomic groups, poor housing, poor employment, race issues and social exclusion, poor education. They're all factors that are heavily associated with drug addiction. So it's all weighted against these people from before they were born. Now we know that this is David's very famous slide. If you rank the different drugs, alcohol is right up the top there, with by far the most dangerous drug. This scheme does not in any way, it doesn't accurately reflect the classification system as we have it. The ABC or the schedules 1, 2, 3, etc. is not. If the classification system was correct, then all of the top ones should be Class A, and then Class B, and then Class C, etc. But it's not. This is an interesting slide. I picked 2006 from the. This is from the Office of National Statistics of drug-related deaths. I picked 2006 really because it just shows how crap this data is. Because they reckon 17 people died of cannabis in 2006. They clearly didn't, so it does make you sort of question the rest of the statistics. And also the MDMA one is very much out. But otherwise, it does show just what drugs are the most dangerous. Now, we have this system then. So we have the classification of drugs in which you have Class A, Class B, Class C, Class D, etc. And then you have the scheduling, Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3. Now, the classes is really a legal framework in which to allow judges when sentencing to decide the penalties for possession or for distribution and supply of holding of particular drugs. And the scheduling is more to help doctors and pharmacists decide what sort of drugs carry what sort of dangerous weights, those that are licensed. And they don't tally up with each other at all. So, for example, Heroin, which is a Class A drug, which means that it carries very heavy penalties, is not a Schedule 1 drug because it's deemed to have medical uses. So although it's a Class A drug if it's misused, it can be used under Schedule 2, which makes it very easy to possess as a doctor and to prescribe. But then you've got drugs like LSD and MDMA. Now they're a Class A drug in terms of their illegality, but they're Schedule 1 because they are deemed to not have any medical uses. So the irony being that I as a doctor can hold heroin, but I can't hold LSD because heroin has uses and LSD doesn't. But they're both Class A if they're being used by someone without a license. Now, where this is really relevant is in research. And myself and David have been sort of banging away about this for quite some time. Because it's very hard to set up research studies with Schedule 1 drugs. Because you have to have all sorts of government licenses and they're very expensive. So we need to tackle not only the classification systems, A, B, C, etc., but also the scheduling 1, 2, 3 in order to help us with the research. So just to concentrate a little bit on heroin. So in the field of addictions, we have this kind of interplay of harm minimization versus recovery. Harm minimization is about safe drug use, reducing the harms of drug use, but acknowledging that drug use continues. And we do things like needle exchange, we give opioid replacement therapy, which is methadone and buprenorphine. We educate people about drug use, we give naloxone, which is an antagonist to reverse opioid overdoses. What we don't do in this country are what they call shooting galleries or safe injection sites. And also what we don't do on the NHS is heroin, prescribing diamorphine. And they do this in lots of other places. I had a patient the other day who was 10 years in the Netherlands, and he talked to me about the injection sites that he used to go to. And so he said there's a big area and it's all cordoned off, and you go there and it's full of addicts and they can either buy clean heroin or they can be prescribed clean diamorphine. There's nurses there that will help them inject. There's all these booths where you inject. There's places to stash the needles, so it's all safe. And it's great because the streets are clean. There's no dealers on the streets. There's no needles on the streets. There's no drug users on the streets. They all go to this place a few times a day to take their medicine. And in some ways, if you imagine this country adopting that idea, people would just think that's weird, knowing that that building over there is full of people injecting heroin. And that's why, you know, the sort of right-wing press are not adopting this, despite the growing evidence that this is the right thing to do. This Strang article that came out this month, it was just two weeks it's come out, which demonstrates the safety and efficacy of these services. But why, and this is what John Strang says, he says, what more evidence does this government need to recognise that this is the way to treat heroin addicts? And they're not doing it because they just think, we can't possibly imagine knowing that that building there is full of people injecting heroin. That's just too much to imagine. So what I would say is, well, where are people taking heroin today then? This is where they're taking it. They're taking it in that flat there, in that car over there. They're taking it in the toilets over there. They're taking it at the breakfast table with their kids running around. You know, so the heroin use is going on. It should be in a single place where it's safe and monitored. But what's the real problem with opioids? The real problem with opioids in this country is not heroin use. The real problem, the one we hear less about, is prescribed medication. Now this is out of control at the moment. Methadone, buprenorphine, codeine, dihydrocodeine, tramadol, they're all opiates. They are hugely abused in this country, dished out like Smarties. We're in the same position now as we were about 20 years ago with Valium and other benzodiazepines in terms of the GPs overprescribing. The number of patients who are being prescribed these drugs. And there's a really interesting correlation between the prescription opioids and death rates from heroin, because both go up and they mirror each other. So this is a real problem. And then these other drugs, pregabalin, gabapentin, etc., they're not opiate drugs, but they are also overprescribed drugs that we're seeing in amongst patients. This is the big, because it's pharma-led, we don't hear this story, but this is the bigger problem. I sometimes think of the Stone Circle at Glastonbury as a really good public sphere to judge what drugs are going around. So every year when I'm sitting up there, I always sort of hear what's going, 5 years ago it was all methadone, and 2 years ago it was all ketamine, and 10 years ago it was all MDMA. So when I was up there, the last time I was up there, what was I hearing people selling? Codeine, codeine, anyone want codeine? DF118s, strips of tablets everywhere. It's a real big thing. Kids are using prescription drugs and they're on the streets more than ever. Okay, cannabis. Very briefly about cannabis, really. I just wanted to look at this question. The reason that we are not legalising cannabis as fast as we should be in this country is because of this issue about psychosis. And this issue, does cannabis cause schizophrenia? I would say absolutely not does it cause schizophrenia. It's absolutely true that cannabis does induce a transient psychosis in certain people with the psychotic fragility. It does put people into hospital as a result of their cannabis use, especially high THC strains and low CBD strains. So it precipitates psychosis in certain individuals. And also, it's true, and we've got good data for this, using high-strength cannabis or any cannabis from an early age in adolescence does affect long-term brain function, and that's good, robust evidence there. So what I sometimes say to the kids I work with when they're like 13 years old and like, oh yeah, Dr. Banner smoked a blunt on the way to school, I just say, can you just put it off until you're 18? And then it's not so bad because your brain has matured. So that's robust, but what's not robust is the idea that cannabis causes schizophrenia. It really doesn't, and it's very important to know that. If cannabis caused long-term schizophrenia, we'd have clearly far more cases of chronic schizophrenia in heavy cannabis smoking populations, and we just don't. The schizophrenia rate is about 1% all over the world, whether you're a high-smoking population or not. It's not caused, but it is triggered in those vulnerable people. And cannabis has amazing medical properties. The sort of pro-cannabis community will tell you it cures absolutely everything. The top four, which are in bold, those are the medicinal aspects of cannabis where we have evidence-based data and where the drug is licensed in those places that can supply medicinal cannabis. The pro-cannabis lobby will tell you that it does all these other things as well. And it may or may not, but we just don't have the data on that yet. So you see all sorts of things on Facebook about cannabis cures cancer. Maybe, but we haven't got the data yet. So the top ones we do though, it's very clear for those. And the cannabis dispensaries in the States are, makes us look really silly in this country and very backward, and I can't wait until I can open a cannabis dispensary. Here's the situation at the moment with cannabis. So we've got 4 states now. Oregon went a couple of weeks ago, didn't it? So Colorado, Alaska, Oregon, and Washington, where it's totally available to over is it 21s? Probably 21s, not 18, isn't it? Adults who want to use it for recreational use. And that's recreational. And then in over 50% of the rest of the states, it's licensed for medical use. But even where it's licensed for medical use, it's very easy to get and use it as recreational use because the medical care system in America is so bad anyway. As long as you've got $250 in your pocket, you can get anything from your doctor. So that's the States. Uruguay, weird and amazing policy of just complete legalization. Holland have had this interesting policy of tolerating the sale and use of cannabis from restricted outlets, but it's still actually strictly illegal, but they've had this policy going since the early 70s. Portugal, they've decriminalised everything, but they're not legal, which means that you can get a fine, but it's just a civil fine. It's not a criminal problem. And then a lot of other countries, Canada, Czech Republic, Israel, have got medicinal use. What's happening in the UK, I don't know. I love that picture there. Someone took a picture with Ed Miliband. Remember him? So, and just as they were taking this picture, they whipped out their bong. And it went viral. And there's... Okay. This is my pipe dream. I've travelled all over the world to these places as a much younger person. Some of the best, most righteous, natural cannabis in the world is grown in the very poorest countries. And my dream is to see high THC, low CBD strains of skunk taken off the streets of the UK and natural cannabis brought into this country in a fair trade way, which will boost the living standards of these very poor countries and provide our country with low psychotogenic, good quality natural cannabis for those people who want to use it. So I look forward to the day when I'm standing at Bristol docks unloading bales from Kathmandu, but we're not there yet. This is of all the research chemicals, this is the real problematic one, and an absolute illustration of the stupidity of the war on drugs. That cannabis, a relatively non-toxic substance, is being, because we can't get it and it's illegal, kids are taking this stuff. This is really nasty. This is potent CB1 agonist, which is synthetic cannabis, but it's really nothing like cannabis. The effects can either be hugely sedative or, rather weirdly, hugely aggressive and stimulated. And we're seeing massive problems in drug services and legal services and the police and the casualty departments with people using spice. It's a bit like if you made water illegal. People would make their own water and die from it. You know, this is a weird situation that kids can take this because it's legal, and it's way worse than the cannabis they should be taking if they want to take that. So that, of all the research chemicals, is the worst. Briefly on MDMA, this guy looks just like my nephew, but it's not him. So MDMA has its risks, of course, but it's generally a very, very safe drug. How many people actually die from taking ecstasy? The official statistics are around about 20 to 40 a year, and it's been pretty steady on that since the late 80s. But if you, as we know from that slide I put up earlier, the official statistics of death rates from drugs aren't really a good measure of what drugs people are taking, because of those 20 to 40, about 60% of them would also, on the coroner's form, have been not just ecstasy, but also alcohol and opiates as well. So when you take all that out of it, it's probably no more than 3 deaths a year. And we're talking 500,000 ecstasy doses being taken every weekend in this country for the last 25 years. Now, those 3 deaths are tragic, and they need to, and you know, we can't take our eye off the ball there. MDMA probably is a more dangerous substance physiologically than the classical psychedelics, which are sort of zero toxicity, as we know. But what's the point about this in drug policy is that even that's only 3 deaths a year, by God do we hear about it. It's the front page of the paper. Some kid dies of taking ecstasy. Why is it the front page of the paper? It's always been this way, that we like this sensationalist viewpoint about drugs. And especially ecstasy. I did an interview with the paper about 10 years ago on MDMA therapy, and the journalist was really nice, and we wrote a really balanced piece about it. And then at the end of it, when it came out, the headline was, "British doctor says kids should take ecstasy." And I was like, what? And I rang the paper and I said, what on earth is that about? And what he'd done is he'd also compared it. They had, as part of the same article, interviewed the parents of some kid who took 15 ecstasy tablets and died. And it was really, and they were saying, this evil Dr. Sessa. And I spoke to the editor and I just said, what on earth did I at any point suggest people should take 15 ecstasy tablets and go to a nightclub? Now I said, he said, oh, we have to get a balance. I said, no, if you'd found a death of someone who took MDMA in therapy under clinical supervision and died, now there's a balance. But not that, it's chalk and cheese. It's not a level playing field when it comes to the reporting of ecstasy and drug deaths. So briefly, into the future, where are we going with all this? So you no longer have to sort of hang around the shady toilets on station platforms to buy your drugs nowadays. 3 clicks of a mouse and any drug you want anywhere on the planet will be delivered to your door in about 12 hours in an unmarked envelope, and you can pay with your dad's credit card. And the online sale of drugs is a hugely competitive business with hundreds, if not thousands, of websites, both within the open net and the dark net, and there's a very fluid, dynamic shifting from illegal to sort of legal to might be illegal next month, but this month it's okay. This grey area, it's hugely popular, and that's where people are buying their drugs. And we have had this huge explosion of these novel psychoactive substances over the years. I mean, this is only since 2008. Look how quickly these new novel psychoactive substances have come in. And the very strong argument here is the reason we've got that position is because people can't get safe regulated drugs. So they buy their novel psychoactive substances. And as I said, we've got things like Shiny Flakes, although they just got busted recently. Silk Road, and they got busted, but there's loads more out there, and they're creeping from the dark net into the open net. And this is a really good way of looking at the toxicity of drugs. Because we have so many new novel psychoactive substances coming up, the government and the official line on them can't tell you about them. You know, if you're a doctor in casualty and you've got a patient, he's come in and he says, I've taken C3362L. What's that? You're not going to find anything about that drug on the ACMD website because the government has no idea. I mean, ACMD are just starting to look at mephedrone, you know, 10 years later. So, but Erowid, you can bet your life there'll be tens of thousands of people's anecdotal experiences of that drug with alcohol, with ketamine, with cannabis, with cocaine, you know, and they're anecdotal, they're not clinical studies, but it's a really good database, and the same for Blue Light. So we're in this weird position where we have 60 years toxicity data of LSD, quarter of a century toxicity data with MDMA, thousands of years toxicity data for cannabis. But the kids today are not using these drugs like they were. They're buying this stuff online. Why would they want to spend 50 or 60 pounds on a bag of what's supposed to be MDMA crystal or cocaine when it's almost certainly cut with all sorts of other things? They've got to buy it off a shady dealer. It's cut, it's expensive, and it's illegal when they can go online, 3 clicks of a mouse, and get sent a little bag of white powder. They don't care what it is. It just says on the box, stimulant. And it works. It works. These things work if you try them. It's not MDMA, it's not cocaine, but the kids don't mind. They stay up all night, dance, don't sleep for 36 hours, have loads of sex, laugh. You know, it doesn't really matter. And crucially, they can wave it in the face of an officer. They can say, look what I'm on tonight. And it's legal. And that's a weird situation that we're in. And, okay, so sorry to show you a picture of David Cameron. So we've got this situation. I'm just going to inflate a nitrous balloon here, because we're not going to be able to do this for much longer. So, the legal highs thing. Why don't we just make problematic drugs illegal? If we make them illegal, they just go away, don't they? So, I don't understand why we don't do that to cocaine and heroin. I mean, okay, cocaine and heroin, are they illegal? I don't think they are they? But the point is, you ever been to festivals? You would have seen this. This is legal, but it won't be. There we go. I wasn't going to do it in case you thought I might. So, I've got more. So, the point is that this idea that we don't like it, so let's make it illegal, and then it'll just disappear. It doesn't work. It's so naive that if things are illegal, then no one would want to take them, no one would want to use them, no one would want to buy them or sell them. It's fiction. But why was the war on drugs started? It was there to protect us. It clearly wasn't there to protect us, and Nixon sums it up beautifully here. So I'm a scientist and I don't go with the conspiracy theory things, but this is not a conspiracy theory. The war on drugs is not and never was a public health protection issue. It never was. It was a framework for controlling people. It makes me sound like some crazy conspiratorial thing. It's not. This is fact. It's rooted in racism, it's rooted in greed, it's rooted in corporate finance, and it always was and it still is. And that's what's going on. And I'm just about to finish. So, who doesn't want any change to the drug laws? There's 3 main groups who don't want any change. One is the drinks industry. They are very keen, the drinks industry, they are very keen that we do not have any change in their regulations. They own the only, apart from coffee and stuff and cigarettes, they own the only allowed psychoactive chemical that we're allowed to alter our consciousness with. The other group are this, just kind of dead in the water, anti-drugs people. They're sort of very right-wing. They just drugs are bad and they're just bad, I'm not going to talk about it. You know, with a fag in one hand and a pint in the other, because they're not drugs. And then the other group is crime, the mafia, the people who own the drug distribution network. They don't want drugs legalised, no thank you. They've got a very nice little idea going on. And then we've got the argument, the cognitive liberty argument, which is a very strong argument. The idea that we as adults ought to be allowed to experience this vast range of different mental states. There are many mental states and we're restricted to alcohol. And it's a very strong argument. And there's religious arguments as well. So this could be the future. 3D molecular desktop printing. So you have your 3D printer and you download, you pour into it your basic organic components, and then you download your molecules from the net. So, and then you plug your vaporizer in and it bubbles away and it pushes it into your vaporizer and you go out with it. And so you can say, like, with your credit card or PayPal, I want 4 hours of ketamine, 3 hours of MDMA, 2 large gins and a couple of spliffs. Bubble, 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 and then you just walk around with your... It sounds really crazy, but this is now happening at an industrial level. And these machines are vast and they take up the whole room and they cost like tens of millions of pounds. But it's happening in terms of molecular drug synthesis. And the ways that technology works, and especially computer technology, is everything that was the size of a room and cost $10 million 10 years ago is now on our desktop. This will be the next thing. So these are my final slide, some of the discussion points. Is prohibition holding back research? Is there a valid harm minimisation argument for buying stuff on the internet? Is it better to buy things on the internet where you know where they're coming from and you're as best as possible because it's a buyer's market? Is the whole problem that we've got with research chemicals and that kind of aspect of thing a response to the war on drugs itself? The cognitive liberty argument, is it a right for us to, do we have a human right to alter consciousness? Can we even stop that? And does total prohibition work? Does it work to reduce the harms of drugs, the criminality of drugs, the destruction of societies, deaths, or even, weirdly, usage? What the experiments in Portugal and Spain and Uruguay are showing us that not only does the harm of drugs come down, but the usage actually comes down when these drugs are legalised. And what would a post-prohibition look like, Britain look like? So that's what we're going to be debating. Thank you.